All right. Hi, everybody, and thanks for attending this philosophy talk. It's the second to last philosophy talk that is generously funded by SGA. I'm Leilani Bartel. I'm a senior philosophy minor and co-president of PST, the Philosophy Honor Society. Today we have Dr. William Desmond, who is a very distinguished professor and philosopher, and he's come a very long way to be here and present this talk called The Voice of the Irish, Philosophy and Literature. Excuse me. Sorry, the Heraclitus talk. Sorry.
That was last night.
Sorry about that. My mistake. He's very well known for a trilogy of books that he wrote called Being and the Between, Ethics and the Between, and God and the Between. And he's especially known for his metaphysical notion of the metaxological sense of being, and more broadly, just in general, known for his systematized philosophies and ideas on being. And we kindly thank him for coming all this way to talk here for us, and I will turn it over to him.
And afterward, you can ask questions of Professor Desmond.
Yes.
I mean, I'd give the same lecture as last night if you like. The title of my talk is Flux Gibberish, and the original title was For and Against Heraclitus, but it has to do with interpreting Heraclitus, since you're involved with the theme of hermeneutics. Now, I'll read some passages, and I'll extemporize on some of the themes that I have written about. I gave the paper just a little bit about a year ago at the Metaphysical Society of America, so there are passages of metaphysical analysis in it, but it's not just a scholarly analysis of Heraclitus in the way that some maybe more ordinary classical philologists look at his texts. I call it a companioning approach. There are certain philosophers that you don't necessarily make an object of scholarly research, which is not to say that you don't try to read as much of the scholarly research as possible, but that particular philosopher is more a companion to the kinds of thoughts that you are trying to think yourself. And Heraclitus is a philosopher that particularly lends himself to this companioning approach. There are many, both philosophers and sometimes poets and others who have found Heraclitus a source of inspiration for their own work. So that's what I mean by companioning, and I try to distinguish it from what I call the ventriloquizing approach. Now, again, scholars have this tendency sometimes to fall in love with the object of their research, but sometimes it turns out that they're ventriloquizing their own opinions to the object or the beloved, and hence when they read Heraclitus, sometimes it turns out really that the voice that comes back to us from Heraclitus is exactly like the interpreter. So that's what I mean by the ventriloquizing approach. Someone like Hegel, I'll mention Hegel later. Hegel discovers in Heraclitus the seeds of his own way of philosophizing, and in a certain sense Heraclitus turns out to have the same voice as Hegel. Another example that I'll mention just again briefly in passing, Heidegger. Heidegger in the 20th century, considered by some to be perhaps the most significant voice in the 20th century, dark and complex figure, but he has claimed that the philosophers before Socrates have had a sense of being which has been lost in the last 2,000 years. But he has read people like Parmenides and Heraclitus, and when he does so, strangely enough, Parmenides and Heraclitus tend to have exactly the same voice as Heidegger. So the other is used, again, with a ventriloquist. You have your puppet, and the puppet speaks your voice. Now, is it possible to avoid that entirely? Perhaps not. Maybe when we're interpreting someone that we have a certain love for, inevitably aspects of our own voice comes back to us. So I'm hoping that I'm not just simply ventriloquizing through Heraclitus. So this word, flux gibberish, I don't know that it exists in any dictionary at the moment. Maybe it will go into a dictionary, but I'll explain the source of my reflection here. I was reading Aristotle's Metaphysics, book 4, where he particularly talks about the Heracliteans. more the Heracliteans than Heraclitus himself. But I detected what I sensed was a note of real irritation on the part of Aristotle. We tend to think that philosophers don't get irritated. But the more you hang around with philosophers, you realize that they have all the human, all too human characteristics of ordinary mortals as well. So why was Aristotle irritated? And I think one of the reasons was that the Heracliteans, emphasizing flux, seem at the same time to deny any constancy of intelligibility. Now, that's my theme, really. Looking at the flux, but is it just flux, or is flux more complex than just flux? And how think together not only flux, but flux and intelligibility? Is there a kind of constancy of intelligibility at work in the unfolding and the streaming of flux itself? Aristotle's irritation, I think, comes from his feeling that the followers of Heraclitus emphasize becoming to such an extent that they undermine the constancy of intelligibility. So you can never pin them down as to what really they're saying. Now they say A, now they say not A. You pin them down with not A, and they'll go back and say A. So they oscillate back and forth between negation and affirmation. They keep the conversation going in such a manner that you're really never sure what determinate articulation or determinate proposition they're offering to you. In some ways, this orientation, again, you're all too young for this, but here in America, in the heyday of deconstruction, and deconstruction is a movement in philosophy that owes something to Heidegger, something to Nietzsche, but it has a kind of Heraclitean dimension to it also, insofar as it tends to say there is no determinate meaning that could be made absolutely stable. Everything is in a process of othering or differing. And when I was living here in the 80s and the early 90s, deconstruction was in its heyday, and very often, in fact, my own tendency at times was to think of Aristotle's irritation with the Heracliteans and ask whether this way of talking also was something like flux gibberish. Okay. No, again, I mean, how many people do know anything about deconstruction? It's passé now. It was the height of the revolutionary movement in intellectual cultural developments in the 80s and the early 90s. But these revolutionaries of those decades have now become tenured faculty, and in fact have become senior faculty. So they become the old fogies in literary departments. And there's nothing more like the kiss of death to revolutionary ardor than growing old. So maybe James Madison has been spared from that wave of newness. Okay, so that's the issue here, constancy and intelligibility, granting flux, because again, I don't want to deny flux. There is a certain streaming or becoming in the nature of things. Things do change, but what's the meaning of that becoming? What I want to say is that, again, I hope you've read some Heraclitus, but his way of speaking is characterized by what I call a kind of saturated equivocity. Again, I can explain that just very briefly in relation to philosophers generally think of equivocity as a problem that needs to be addressed and solved. If something is equivocal, if a set of propositions is equivocal, you find the univocal solution in which the logos is made consistent with itself. Whereas if you're speaking equivocally, you're saying things in different senses, but you're not keeping apart the different senses. And these differences lead to a kind of confusion between opposites, so to say. Now, I'll look at a few citations from Heraclitus in a second, but his way of speaking is saturated with what looks like equivocity from the standpoint of a normal logic of univocity. And one of the things that I want to do is to say that this can be looked at not just as flux gibberish in a bad sense, but rather as reflecting a sense of being a sense of the world as marked by a kind of doubleness that resists reduction to the more simple univocicities of standard logic. Now, it's not alogical, it's not illogical, but it seems to require a different kind of logos. Again, that's very important to remind ourselves about Heraclitus. Even though he is a philosopher of the flux, he's also a philosopher of logos. Again, a great word redolent of so many rich meanings. But logos has to do with many things, but it has to do also with a certain articulation of intelligibility. Things have a certain pattern or rhythmic structure that when we understand the nature of a becoming, it isn't just simply a flat stream. It's riddled, so to say, through and through with a moving kind of intelligibility, which our logos tries to mirror. So let me just say a few things about the words flux gibberish. Okay, just looking at the words for a moment. And I'll just read a little bit from my text. So in the word flux, there is the sense of the fluent, the Latin word fluere. And with this, the sense of the labile and the mobile. So again, flux is often thought of as formless, but this is obviously not so if we think of the connection of flux and reflux. And I'm playing with words, I admit. There's a coming and a going. We are referred to a recurrence, a pattern. I'll give you two examples. The tides. If you ever are by the sea comes in, the sea goes out. Very simple thing. But there's a pattern in the recurrence. It's not that on Monday the sea comes in and says, look, this is only Monday, I'm getting tired, I'm going to stay here for the rest of the week. I'll go out on Friday afternoon because, that's the weekend. I'm allowed to take a rest. No, it comes in, it goes out twice every day. So there's a pattern in the movement itself. Another cyclical pattern that I find very interesting are the circadian rhythms. I'm just giving you an example of that. But the circadian rhythm has to do with the diurnal, nocturnal regulation of our bodies. And it's something that's inscribed in us. We don't construct it ourselves. Our bodies are, in mysterious ways, in attunement with the cosmic cycles. I flew from Dublin last Thursday, and my circadian rhythm is distorted precisely because I moved too fast, too far around the globe. And my body is trying to synchronize itself with the place that I geographically ended up in the last few days. But this is a pattern, a recurrent pattern that seems to be inscribed in our very bodies, but it's in tune with something of a more cosmic character. Again, I think that is a very, very rich place for thinking how, in fact, we think of ourselves as self-sufficient integrities of being, cut off from others, cut off from the rest of nature, but in fact at deep and sometimes very secret and unstated ways, where it's not that we're in tune, but we're tuned in such a manner that things happen to us, even though we might want to just simply fly across the globe and not endure the effects of something like jet lag. Again, this is a little bit of a sort of an addendum. The studies indicate that children, their cycle, they go to sleep usually when the sun goes down, and they begin to wake up when the sun comes up. And as we go into adulthood and have all of our important projects and get busy about our place in the world and so on, our sleeping changes. We stay up all night, sometimes studying very hard. I understand that that's the most important reason why we stay up late at night to read Heraclitus in the original Greek. But as we get older, and I find this as we're all getting older, but I feel as if I'm getting older in a more intimately existential sense. Apparently, the cyclical, it returns closer to the childhood pattern. Older people go to bed earlier when the sun goes down. Now, it could be the case that older people are more bored with the world, and there's nothing on television after 6:30 news. But no, it seems as if the body itself reverts to something like the original pattern, going to bed early and getting up earlier in the morning. So I know almost all of you are very young at the moment, so you have something to look forward to, not just social security, but the return of your body into a deeper attunement with the cosmic patterns when you pass a certain threshold of age. Okay, back to the word flux. One of the complications I have here, I'm trying to save the planet by printing my paper on two sides. But when I start giving a talk, then I forget that there's stuff on the back of the page. And I turn the page and I say, where the hell am I? Okay, so flux, reflux, the word influence. And I'm just giving you a range of connotations. Flowing in, influence. Flux seems to be a more watery word than a fiery word, more Thales' word and less Heraclitus' word, for whom fire figures notably. Interesting is the word flush, a rush of water. A flush of the face, in shame, for instance, in the blush, say. Flush may be related to flash, water and fire coming together. We think of a flash flood, the flash of fire and the flush of water together, Heraclitus and Thales. A royal flush in poker, the summum of card combinations, the highest run of the cards, again run, beyond which nothing greater can be gotten. One cannot run or flow or move higher. Now, I hope the poker players in our midst know what a royal flush is, and probably no one has ever gotten one here. So running, of course, reminds us of streaming. The Greek phrase famous from Heraclitus is panta rei, all flows. There's a downside in older age when we suffer from rheumatism. The Greek word rheumatazdein, suffer from the flux, from rheuma, that which flows, a bodily discharge. Worse in wet weather, it is said, according to folk wisdom. Dryness and wetness are not far away in the thinking of Heraclitus. A drunk soul is wet, he says. Rheuma and rhea, the flow again, as in diarrhea, logorrhea, excessive flow of words, already on the threshold of gibberish. Now you can find perhaps some contemporary thinkers that suffer from logorrhea. Check out Zizek on YouTube for a world-famous example of this condition. Interesting, the word rheum, R-H-E-U-M, rheum, there's a possible relation to the word rhythm. A rhythm marks an unfolding but a recurrent pattern. Again, that's my theme. If there is flux here, once again, it is not quite formless. Now there's a story, perhaps apocryphal, that Heraclitus, disgusted with his fellow men, retreated to the mountains and fed himself on herbs, only to suffer there from the dropsy. Dropsy is the accumulation of water in the body. And to be cured of this, he went back down, but he issued a paradoxical taunt to his fellow citizens, doctors. How do you make a drought out of a rainstorm? So that kind of doubleness, this paradoxical, seemingly contradictory, riddling aspect of Heraclitus' way of talking. So Heraclitus is said to have immersed himself in a heap of dung. You know what dung is? With the thought that the heat of the dung, now if you've ever been around dung, you notice it steams, it gives off heat, as in a compost heap. But he believed it would evaporate the moisture of the dropsy in his body. That's the story, whether it's true or not we don't know, but in any case, the story is also that instead of Heraclitus curing himself of the dropsy, he himself evaporated, so to say, and passed on. So he died in a heap of SHI. There are even stories that have come down to us that covered with this excrement, the dogs went after his body and tore him to pieces. But these are sort of stories that how do we know if they're true or not? But they're recorded sometimes maybe by the enemies of Heraclitus, sometimes by those who considered him to be a real oddball. So surely he must have done strange things like that. Okay, so that's flux. What about the word gibberish? Now again, I find the etymologies of these words very interesting, because the multiple meanings often are not just a kind of a scattering of unrelated significances. There's often a kind of constellation of very deep significance in some words. So gibberish, it refers to a speech that is quick and unintelligible, rapid and inarticulate. It's related perhaps to the word jabber, to chatter. It was used in the early 17th century for the language of rogues and gypsies, outsiders beyond the law. The language of the stranger or the foreigner is gibberish. They gibber jabber, they gabble. Gibbering is sometimes associated with idiots and madmen. They speak and they do not speak. Now again I say, think of the language constructed by James Joyce in Finnegan's Wake. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to read Finnegan's Wake, but it really does come across initially certainly as gibberish. But it's English deconstructed and reconstructed by runs of mongrel punnings, perhaps a kind of flux gibberish for those who would disparage it. Joyce's brother thought what his older brother did in his second phase of writing was just, he called it genius gone mad. So maybe that's the fate of some kinds of geniuses. But again, I'm just giving you this. If you ever, it is a kind of advertisement for Finnegan's Wake. If you read, there's a moving speech by Anna Livia Pluribel. That's the name Joyce gives to the River Liffey as it flows down from the mountains and finally into Dublin Bay. So the River Liffey runs through Dublin, which in Irish is the Black Pool, Dublin. At the end of her journey, as she's about to flow into the arms of the sea, it's powerfully evocative of the meeting of the waters, river rush home to sea. Now again, you said that there is actually on YouTube, a minute or two, Joyce reciting. When you look at it as visual text, it's almost unintelligible, but when he speaks it, it has that undulating, rivery, flowing quality, and significance comes through in the mimicking of the flowing. So gibberish is speaking that is not speaking. It speaks to none. Does it give a sign? Heraclitus has, one of his fragments states, "The Lord whose oracle is at Delphi neither speaks out nor conceals, but gives a sign." Perhaps surprisingly, since Apollo is the god of light at Delphi. Of course, the language of oracles is gibberish to scientifically minded philosophers. The language of a Hegel or a Heidegger would be gibberish to such types. So flux gibberish, a flash flood of speech that comes forth to communicate but passes by without communicating, saying everything in a rush and saying nothing that remains despite this rush. A cascade of sounds, seeming to be significant but perhaps signifying nothing. That's the question that we're asking here. Now again, just one last little sort of picture. There can be an element of threat or menace in gibbering. So I think of the child gibbering in fear before a punitive or brutal parent, or terror at a ghost itself gibbering. What is a ghost? A ghost is an apparition of the labile dead that reduces one to jelly. Now again, maybe you haven't seen ghosts, but since I come from Ireland, there are a few ghosts, if you go outside Dublin, still hanging around. One's bones flow away like water, to echo the scriptures. One recalls examples of a horrifying kind of gibbering, such as when William James, speaking of the sick soul, mentions, quotation, he talks about the green-skinned youth of black hair that reduced the observer to horror and a mass of quivering fear. Now again, I don't know if you studied William James, but he's talking about someone reporting seeing this green-skinned youth. It was himself seeing this, so he had this feeling of gibberish, which instead of sort of leading to metaphysical speculation, led to this sense of horror. And there's a similar image in Nietzsche, which I just want to mention here. Quoting Nietzsche, what didn't appear in his published text, is, in his unpublished work, he says, and listen to this: "What I fear is not the horrible shape behind my chair, but his voice. It is also not the words, but the dreadfully inarticulate and inhuman shape, sound of that shape. Yes, if only it would speak as human beings speak." So this experience of gibberish can have not only induce not only logical irritation, as it seems to have done so with Aristotle, but can induce a kind of existential, even a kind of metaphysical horror, as Nietzsche here gives testament to. Okay, let me just keep there's a clock up there. Okay, so we're going until 11:15, right? So and we'll have time for discussion. But let me note first, and I'll just read a few things now from Heraclitus, and then from that on I'll extemporize in saying a few things about Nietzsche and Hegel, and then come back to flux gibberish again at the end. But I touched just briefly earlier on the characteristic mode of utterance of Heraclitus, and I just want to give you some representative citations of this doubleness that I talked about earlier, what I call the saturated equivocity. So he says, in one fragment, he says, we find the togetherness of seawater. Seawater is both pure and polluted. It is pure for the fish, but it is poison for the human. So purity and poison coexisting. Another fragment, he says, the name of the bow is life, but its work is death. Again, one characteristic of Heraclitus is this, I would call it semantic compression. In a very few words, he indicates more than you can pin down, really. But he plays with the words bios. Bios with the accent on the O is a bow, but bios with the accent on the iota, the I, is life. So this conjunction of life and death, indicated by the same word, but a slight alteration in the accent. So trying to say, in a way, too much in the smallest possible articulation. He tells us in another that we are minded of how the living and the dead are always changing into each other. In another, again, things are taken as a whole, are to be taken as a whole and not as a whole. In another, again, he gives a set of the doubleness of descriptions in describing God. It is suitable to describe the God as both day and night, winter and summer, war and peace, satiety and want. Even the word want could be translated as famine. So a kind of extreme emptiness on the one hand and an extreme fullness at the same time. So it seems like, as I say, a very illogical way of talking, but the question is if it's more than that. Another example, it's in changing that things repose. So only by changing actually do you remain the same. If you don't change, you cannot maintain the integrity of your being. And there's another well-loved saying where he says that things being at variance are in agreement, the harmony in the bending back as with the lyre and the bow. So a lyre is in harmony only if it's stretched with a certain tension. We might think of tension as the opposite of harmony, but in fact without the tension there is no, beautiful notes cannot be played if the string is too slack. And similarly you can't shoot the bow if it doesn't have enough tension in it. So again, another one, excuse me for just giving you a few of these, he says, speaking of the divine, again, he says, one, the wise, so the wise is one, it is willing and unwilling to be called by the name of Zeus. So again, Zeus is the name for the highest god, but he says yes and no at the same time. And in some sense, he thinks to say yes and no at the same time is more true to what's at stake. But again, from the standpoint of more standard Aristotelian logic, that seems to be contradictory. Okay, maybe that's a sufficient sampling of some of his statements. But again, I just refer to James Joyce. I mentioned this last night very briefly, but Joyce has this phrase that he wanted to think 2 thinks at a time. 2 thinks at a time. Heraclitus is thinking 2 thinks at a time, perhaps even more than 2 thinks at a time. For instance, if you're asked by a teacher to give an answer to a question and you want to say so much that it starts to come out as a kind of stuttering rather than an uttering. Now, sometimes the teacher will look at you and say, "Stop gibbering." But in fact, you may have more to say than can be said by just one simple sentence, and you're trying to get it out. Sometimes I have that feeling about Heraclitus's highly poetic utterances, that there's a kind of too muchness, pressing forward, trying to find the right articulation. Saying everything at once, but at once mixing things that normally would be chronologically strung out and separated from each other. So just one thing here that I would just say about the approach to Heraclitus is it's sometimes important to get the right approach. I think an aspect of the right approach is what I call here a significant interanimation of mythos and logos. We do not see the logical as a regnant univocal reason superimpositing itself on an equivocal mythos. It is logos in one sense emergent from mythos, but in another sense nurtured on it, and not as a provisional food that will later be replaced by the true rational substitute. Now, I use this notion of superposition. You know, in quantum theory, a superposition is when we can't exactly state where a particle is, or even we have to use a double language of particles and waves to describe the movement of the particle. But the superposition refers to the need for double languages. So it's not a superimposition that we simply impose on the thing, nor is it a juxtaposition where one thing is here and the next thing is there. It's as if the two are interanimating with each other. There's a togetherness at work there of what, from the more normal sort of everyday logic, or indeed also for Aristotelian logic, would be contradictories or opposites. And my argument here is that Heraclitus has sometimes been seen as a primitive in relation to logic precisely because of this way of talking, that he isn't univocal enough, and that he is contradicting himself all of the time. And you'd have many commentators that then will respond to this by trying to reconstruct a more logically consistent Heraclitus. Now, I'm trying to say that that's really to misunderstand the kind of utterance that Heraclitus offers to us. He's not trying to simply give a theory in which univocal propositions are strung out, juxtaposed one after the other. He's communicating in a mode which mixes the poetic and the mythic and the logical in the sense of the logos. The logos itself is saturated with a kind of equivocity that isn't a failure of intelligibility, but rather points to something that is in excess of our normal senses of univocal intelligibility. Okay, let me not get confused. One other thing here too is that if you read Heraclitus, there is what I would call a performative dimension to his writing. Now, what I mean by that is, you know, we in our own epoch tend to read a thing and see it almost as dead on the page. Whereas at this time, certainly, the emergence of literality in the sense of written, graphic, it was on a threshold between the poetic utterance as enacted, as performed. So there's an element to Heraclitus which calls forth a performance of the thought in the way that a poet would perform a poem, rather than just simply write it on the page. Now, this is, in a way, much more present in earlier cultures where the oral was very, very important. and hence the kind of semantic compression in his way of writing, is also a mimetic, a pneumatic instrument to remember. Remember a kind of fullness in the very compressed formulations. So there's what I call an onomatopoeic quality to some of his sayings. So onomatopoeia is when the saying itself mimics the reality. And the famous saying from Heraclitus is that you can't step into the same river twice. And it could be claimed that the Greek itself is a kind of onomatopoeic performance of the river itself babbling, the babbling brook. And I'll just read you what in my efforts at Greek. So here goes. I know you're all, you've got PhDs and more in classical Greek, but you'll forgive me for my efforts to pronounce the Greek. So, patomoisi toisen o toisen embanoisen hetera ka hetera hudata epire. You have that right? The fluency of the water is worded as it flows in a speaking enactment that communicates a fluid passing. So this is, again, you can't put that just into a theory. You can't put the performance into a theory. You have to bring it to life in the enactment of the words themselves. The words are not sort of dead signs on a page. They're wordings. And there's a dimension to Heraclitus, I think, that's absolutely crucial for getting a sense of the type of thinker that he is. Okay, keeping an eye on the time. I have sections dealing with Nietzsche and Hegel as readers of Heraclitus, but they're readers of Heraclitus that have something of this companioning quality that I mentioned at the start. Now, again, if you study Nietzsche, Nietzsche has a lovely little pen picture in a book which was not published in his lifetime called Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks. He gives these pictures of Parmenides, Thales, Heraclitus. It's very worth reading, but again, he makes Heraclitus one of his heroes because he emphasizes becoming and not being. Parmenides is being, Heraclitus is becoming. And he sees in Heraclitus someone who is cognate to his own soul. Some of you are readers of Nietzsche's Zarathustra, and Nietzsche himself says in Ecce Homo that perhaps one of the only predecessors of his own Zarathustra was Heraclitus. So that's a measure of the honor that Nietzsche accords Heraclitus. Now again, there's much more that could be said about Nietzsche's, but he just has a simple contrast of being and becoming. And I argue that that's too simple. The notion of being itself as a becoming, the notion of a self-becoming, there are a whole series of issues there that are, in fact, more complicated. For all of Nietzsche's reverence for Heraclitus, philosophically, I'm not sure that he has the philosophical resources to do justice. What I think is reserved or hidden or suggested by Heraclitus's utterances. And I take the other figure who seems to be the antipodes, the opposite of Nietzsche, Hegel. And Nietzsche is a poetic philosopher, and as a poetic philosopher he has great insights, but he's not necessarily a great systematic thinker. Hegel is honored as one of the great systematic thinkers in the history of philosophy. But again, what's noticeable is that Hegel honors Heraclitus with hugely high praise. He says in his history of philosophy that it's only when we come to Heraclitus that we truly get a concrete dialectic, which of course is consummated later in Hegel's own system. And he even says that there is not a sentence in Heraclitus that I have not included in my science of logic. Now again, you couldn't get higher praise. So I find it kind of paradoxical in one sense and thought-provoking that Nietzsche as the poetic philosopher, Hegel as the systematic philosopher, join hands, so to say, in their reverence for Nietzsche as a companioning thinker, as I'm calling it. I think that Hegel has more systematic resources to do justice to the flux and intelligibility. Again, the metaphysical arguments they're too perhaps complicated for the time that we have available here, but it would be something very like this. Hegel has this logic where he thinks the beginning is indeterminate, and then in a process of determination, there's a becoming that takes place. So we start with the indeterminate, it becomes more determinate, but there's a self-becoming of the origin, the more original position. For Hegel, that becoming ultimately leads to the self-determining of the logos. So there's this triadic structure, indeterminacy, which looks like flux gibberish, lacking the determinate intelligibility of the logos. We have determinate logos, and then we have self-determining thinking, which is, for Hegel, the consummation of the process as a whole. Now, my argument with Hegel is something like this, that Hegel doesn't do justice to the richness of the beginning. That in language that I use, and again, apologies for the complex systematic issues that are at stake here, I talk about not the indeterminate, but the overdeterminate, something that exceeds determination, that there's something to the beginning that is overdeterminate. And determinations and self-determinations are always exceeded by something that cannot be reduced either to determinacy or self-determination. I'll give you an example relevant to Heraclitus. Heraclitus in the ancient world was sometimes called the riddler. And ask yourself about a riddle. When you formulate a riddle, you formulate a perplexing question, the answer to which is not particularly evident. Now, Hegel actually talks about riddles in relation to what he calls symbolic art. This is Oriental, the whole Oriental culture, which for him is the beginning, but it's an indeterminacy of meaning. So a riddle hasn't yet struggled into the light of full determinate intelligibility. The real riddles actually are things like the riddle of the Sphinx. And supposedly Oedipus solves the riddle of the Sphinx and sets in motion for Hegel the mastery of the human being over all indeterminate riddles. But for Hegel, throughout the unfolding of our mindfulness and spirit, it's all oriented towards a teleology, an end where the logos finally becomes fully self-determining. So the beginning is always this indeterminate riddle. But the riddle itself for Hegel is a deficiency that logical unfolding will overcome and supersede. Now, I'm trying to suggest that that's not really as rich a reading of Heraclitus as could be offered. If the beginning is closer to what I'm calling the overdeterminacy, yes, there's a riddle dimension to it, but the point is not to overcome the riddle in a clear and distinct set of ideas. It's to dwell with the riddle, to dwell with the sense of perplexity, to dwell with the sense of mystery that comes with the riddle, and live with it differently at times, not just simply trying to supersede it in a fully logical system. And in that way, I think we can do more justice in a generous way to the poetic and the mythical dimensions of the characteristic utterances that are so powerful in Heraclitus. These are pages. But Hegel has some marvelous pieces, actually, where places where he tries to think passage qua passage, or becoming qua becoming. And it's a very interesting, again, I can't do full justice to it in the time that we've available, but if you're to think of becoming, it's not just enough to think this determination and then the next determination. You have to think the passage between one determination and the next determination. And the space or passage between determinations is not itself a determination. This is one of the reasons why you have to bring in notions like the indeterminate as an opening of transition, of a transience that can't be reduced simply to this determination or that determination, something that in the end can't be pinned down at all. Now, Hegel thinks that his own logical system in the end does, in a certain respect, pin it down, contain it within an extraordinarily ambitious system, to be sure, but nevertheless his logos becomes fully self-determining. Whereas I think, again, the strange discourses of Heraclitus they push back, to use a recent word, they push back against our claims to be the master of this mysterious flux that is not merely gibberish at the same time. Okay, I'm looking at the clock, so you can see my eye turning leftwards. So that's just a very brief indication of why I wouldn't, all honor to Hegel, all honor to Nietzsche, but I think that there's something more in Heraclitus that their characteristic responses don't adequately capture. So again, just let me come back as in conclusion to flux gibberish once again. And I'll read just a little bit at the end to, I want to say something like this, that flux is flux and not flux, gibberish is gibberish and not gibberish. In a strange way, I want to defend gibberish. That we normally think of gibberish as just nonsense, but there are ways of looking at gibberish which can redeem it from that particular picture. So I've just talked about a little bit about the fluency of the world in terms of this process of becoming. But what about gibberish? It's instructive again to call to mind the origin of the word in terms of its etymology. I gave you some of that at the outset. Gibberish is still a form of speaking. It is a logos, though to the hearer it is unintelligible logos relative to logical logos. But is this a function of the gibberish itself, or is it a function of our being unable to hear the logos in the gibberish? As I pointed out above, there are various words involved in the etymology, like gaggle, gabble, and again babble, babbling brook, singing the flux gibberish of nature, of the stream of life. Interesting, babbling brooks often generate pretty bad poetry. If you look at those cards that you're sending to your beloved and talking about sitting by a babbling brook and being carried into the fragrance of your beloved's presence, well, you can make up the rest yourself. You have ready-made poetry to enchant your beloved. And it probably works. I haven't tried it recently, so you can try it and report back to me if the babbling brook trick still works. And again, to recall the onomatopoeic character of that famous statement about stepping into the same river. So I just want to make one point here, and it bears on this rich sense of the origin of articulation that I'm mentioning, this overdeterminacy. I'm thinking of the babble of children, origins of our own access into the space of the world, of the word, into the space of our being able to word the world. The image of the child is very appropriate given Heraclitus' image of the kingly power. Again, a very famous statement, quoting, "Time is a child playing drafts. The kingly power is a child." So it's an image much loved by many, including Nietzsche, in the famous opening discourse of Zarathustra on the three metamorphoses. Again, if some of you know that. In Nietzsche, the child is an image of innocent creation, destruction and recreation to infinity, but constituting the cycle of the whole. No, I won't touch that aspect of it in Nietzsche, but I want to just make the suggestion which I haven't come across myself, and it's the following. The child is first an infant, and the word infant is infans, which literally means without words. And then it begins to babble. The babble is gibberish. It is a struggle for determination and early on it ends mostly in indeterminate results. But the babbling is the intimate becoming of the power of wording of the child. Now just remember, you were babbling, I was going to say idiots, but that didn't come out. But as children, if you watch children struggling to find words, it's absolutely fascinating. You don't know what's going on. I have grandchildren. Their mother is Italian, their father was born in America, but he speaks Dutch also. So there are three languages, and you look at this young boy, and these three languages are struggling with each other, and they mix up with each other sometimes when they come out. But this mysterious process of coming to the Word. And it's not just, of course, just the child. This is what the poetic is all about. This is what the philosophical is all about. This is perhaps what the religious is also all about, finding the right word. We adults listen to the babbling of children, and we try to divine in the babble what the child is trying to communicate. The babble in due course takes on form and becomes more intelligible to the hearer or the interlocutor with the child. Babbling is on the way to wording. Gibberish is on the way to logos. But now consider this question. Will the babble ever articulate communicative form if the child is not in the first instance spoken to? The playing of the child with words, its wording of its being in the between, is not the child playing simply with itself. See, I'm in a sense distancing myself from Nietzsche's circle, where the child seems to be playing with itself. There is another speaking to it. If there were not this wording of another, say the communication of the mother that woos the infant into words, again, if you either are a mother or, fathers are not as important as mothers, very clearly, but just there's a kind of a wooing in babbling itself, where form comes forth. What is latent in the play of babble will not unfold truly, and the child will never enter the cosmos of communication in a fuller sense. Yes, the child plays with itself, but this seems to me to be an incomplete image if we forget that without the other playing with the child, then worlds, like words, do not take on the constancy of form that we do find in the cosmos that communicates. This sense of being spoken to before one speaks seems to me to correspond to the difference between coming to be and becoming. That's a distinction I didn't talk about, but I think there's a coming to be that's prior to becoming, but I passed over it. The child becomes, it does not come to be as giving its own being to itself, and yet it comes to be. So in the gibberish of the flux, the communication of coming to be is prior to the becoming of both the gibberish and the flux. And it's because of this that the flux is flux and not flux. The gibberish is gibberish and not gibberish. Thank you. So we have some time for discussion.
Yes.
Anyone want to babble on a little bit while I drink my water? Give myself the dropsy. Please, go ahead.
So the last bit there, you compared the development of flux, gibberish, with children speaking, with children developing language. Is that correct?
Well, I was trying to give an account of gibberish that shows that it's on the way to logos. It's not the opposite of logos. Whereas when we think of gibberish, usually we think it's a failure of logos. But the distinction between speaking and being spoken to, in parts of the text, Nietzsche and Hegel are philosophers of becoming. And Hegel tries to give a logic of becoming. But I say that there's what I call a coming to be that is prior to becoming. Something has to come to be given to be, before it becomes or becomes itself. So there's a kind of there's a metaphysical issue at stake there, which I didn't really do justice to in what I was saying. And so the fact that the child, the infant, must be spoken to before the word properly comes forth from it indicates that it's not a matter of the self-determination of the child. It's being in receipt of a word that comes to us from beyond ourselves. That's my last point there, really. And I think it's a very important point, because we tend to think of ourselves more and more in Western societies as autonomously self-determining. This extends outside of Heraclitean studies and you name it. We don't always do justice to the fact that we receive from the other before we determine ourselves. And the significance of that, I think, has huge philosophical implications, indeed ethical implications.
studies. Just by that same word, would you consider Heidegger of a becoming thinker as well in the same camp?
Heidegger. I think Heidegger is someone who wants to think what he calls the origin. So he himself says that his vocation is to raise the question of being. And he implies that the question of being has never been properly raised, and that we have to go back to Heraclitus and Parmenides to see an experience of being which is more authentic than what comes to be after Socrates and Plato. I don't think that Heidegger's thinking can be defined by a simple contrast of being and becoming. I don't myself find... he has a kind of rather monolithic interpretation of the whole of Western philosophy from Plato up to Nietzsche, which I think is just too univocal, actually. I think the tradition of philosophy is much more plurivocal. But he is asking a very important question as to what is before determinate logic. And in my own exploration here is trying to also enter into that space. I find in his own writings in Heraclitus that he very much is ventriloquizing. So when he does etymologies of the Greek, he would look at Greek, and he does little steps, little steps, little steps, and then suddenly Heraclitus is talking just like Martin Heidegger. The otherness of Heraclitus is sometimes not, to me anyway, engaged as a companion. I mean, if your companion is always just this mirror image of yourself, you don't have a companion. But the whole question of what the true origin is, Heidegger was obsessed with a new origin. You know, that in the interim from Socrates to Nietzsche was in the end a decadent interim, a falling away from the question of being. And then he wanted to bring the question back in a new beginning after he himself is a kind of emissary of this new beginning. So that sense of the origin, but what he means by the origin, in my view, remains very indeterminate. You see the language, you know, in fact, like if you read the origin of the artwork, and I've written on this, it's a very indeterminate origin. So my own exploration of what origin would be, would recognize, I do think that Heidegger is really raising an important issue, but how he goes about exploring it leaves questions that I think ought to be answered or raised and answered differently. I don't know. I mean, you can't just say he's a philosopher becoming, but certainly he's not. He's intimately aware of the, if you like, the impermanence, the universal impermanence of things. But there's more at play than just becoming, and getting to that level is not easy. Does that go some way to answering your question? Please.
How can Heraclitus and other philosophers' works be translated if, like, so much of the words and meaning comes from words without?
Very good question. Really, they're not easy to translate at all. You know, there's just a law just recently. You know, this is. It's a series that's been going for a century, but they have the Greek and the English. But they've just produced a 9-volume edition of the pre-Socratic thinkers and writers. But it's marvelous to have the Greek. I mean, my Greek was, when I was younger, I had better Greek, and as you get older, various languages kind of tend to get rusty. But I have enough that I can kind of look at the two and get a feeling whether the translations are often informed by philosophical presuppositions that you feel don't always do justice to the original. So a translation is like producing sometimes a new version. And that's why having some feel for the original does make a huge difference, I find. But you're perfectly right. These with this saturated equivocity, you can't translate it into simple prose. So you'd have to have something of the poetic power in your own translation to try and be true to the original. That's probably true of also translating poetry generally, that the translation, it hits and it misses at the same time. But it's not that something isn't communicated, but something where the form and the content are so closely aligned in the case of Heraclitus. Changing the form, which is the new language, also tends to alter the content somewhat. So it's good to be on one's guard against translations at times. Please.
When speaking about gibbering or babbling, you give
Yeah.
two main examples there. And when you strip away the analogy behind them, they kind of have two different underlying meanings, and I'm curious which one you hold to be more true. The first one is you're giving the example of madness, or the sake of the baby babbling with the adult. And there's a sense of objective truth, or I guess logos, if I'm defining that correctly, behind it. The adult has the logical higher ground, and the baby clearly knows, or is interpreting, or giving out no information. But the other analogy you give was that there is the difference between the oracle and the scientist talking to each other. And
Right.
there's inherently madness between the two. The scientist sees the oracle as speaking madness, and very well you can see the other way around, where the oracle thinks the scientist is speaking madness. But both of them are true in their own rights. So is there an objective sense of knowledge here that you're trying to aspire to, or is it becoming something more subjective?
No, well, you'd have to be a god to have that true knowledge. And when I last checked this morning after having a shower, I had not yet attained that status. So, but I don't mean to be facetious, but I think that the problem here is, first of all, to recuperate something of the richness of what is involved in this equivocal language, and that it's not necessarily a deficiency. And we, particularly in modernity, and many philosophers throughout the long tradition, have seen equivocity as a deficiency and want to translate the equivocal into a more, what to them is strictly univocal language. I'm certainly fighting against that, not because I want to deny truth, but that univocal propositions, while they get at something determinate in relation to the truth, don't get at all that's at stake, and least of all do they capture this sense of the overdeterminacy of being, this too muchness. Can you capture it? Very, very difficult. But I think in some instances great poets have managed to do it. Some great sacred writers get a bit close. And I think some philosophers also, I think when you look at the long tradition of philosophers, you'll find ways of speaking that are always transgressing the simple ideal of univocal logic. Hegel is a classic example as a systematic thinker. Nietzsche is an example as a more poetic thinker. Heidegger in the 20th century has his own claims on that particular score. But many, many other philosophers, their logos is porous to what comes to the philosophical logos from the spaces of religion and the spaces of the poetic. And I think in modernity we've tended to make these, you have the poetic as autonomous, you have the religious as autonomous, and we philosophers must be autonomous, self-determining thinkers. I think in the long run that leads to an evacuation of the deeper sources of philosophical thinking. But it's in no sense a giving up on truth, but it's a reform of how the philosopher approaches being true. A being true, not just a truth that can be objectively stated, but it's not that there aren't objective truths in that determinate sense, but philosophy is concerned with a being true that can do justice to these determinate truths as well as other more encompassing senses of being true. How are we doing for time? We got 12 minutes according to the clock. Please.
I was wondering if you would want to say something about the relationship between equivocity and dialect in your understanding of it. And it seems to me the
Right.
picture of Heraclitus, you're supposing is closer maybe to a Hegelian one than a Nietzschean one.
Right, yes, right, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think that Hegel, in his sense of dialectical thinking, comes closer to the sense of the conjunction of opposites that he finds in the characteristic utterances of Heraclitus. But first of all, put Hegel aside for the moment, but I think that what dialectic does is try to mediate equivocities. You know, we try to pin something down univocally, equivocities inevitably arise, but one doesn't have to look at the equivocities in an entirely negative light. We can think through the equivocities and find the inseparability of opposites. Again, this is a very classical orientation, perhaps even in Socratic dialectic, but certainly in Hegelian dialectic. But my objection then to Hegel's dialectic is that this interplay between self and other, identity and difference, or even univocity and equivocity, he is searching for, if you like, a higher speculative univocity. He wants a sense of the whole that can be logically articulated according to the logic of the concept as he understands it. Whereas what I call the metaxological is dwelling in the between space and trying to not, as it were, go flap face down into the flux, so to say, but rather to go with the flux in a manner that does justice to this overdeterminacy that's coming to communication in it. So in other words, being in the between in such a manner that doesn't simply reduce it to one totality. And hence there's an openness in that communication, which I think Hegel tends to believe he has overcome. And again, why the characteristic utterances of Heraclitus, I think, are so powerful is that they come out as almost stutterings. I used that word earlier, but he's saying too much, but in a very lucid way in one sense, but the lucidity is of a different order. And Hegel thinks he has the measure of that in his dialectical logic. Just one instance that, you know, Aristotle in the Rhetoric accuses Heraclitus of grammatical ambiguity, because the opening sentence, one of the phrases, you're not clear which it governs and so on. So Aristotle says, you know, clearly Heraclitus is confused here. Now, of course, it's kind of a flat-footed Aristotle. I mean, Aristotle can be flat-footed at times because he's not getting the power of the saturated equivocity. Heraclitus is not writing this way because he's confused, but because he wants to, as it were, spark a kind of perplexity as to what's going on. For Aristotle, it's just a contradiction. Hegel endorses Aristotle. So Hegel here shows, in my view, a lapse of dialectical finesse simply by following the lead of Aristotle. But that indicates, I think, a characteristic tendency, which is a major tendency in the Western tradition, always to return to some univocal standpoint, however speculative, as the default end of the system, so to say. Whereas what I call the metaxological, it's a dwelling differently in the between. That helps. Please?
So, the introduction or the addition of someone else's thoughts, as in the case of a child and a parent,
Yeah.
The addition of the parent's thoughts would be necessary for the child's thoughts to be formulated into intelligible words or intelligible conversation, so to speak.
Yeah.
How does this, or how does Wittgenstein's conception of the private language argument interact with this? If that's just totally off the mark.
Well, to be honest with you, I've never, Wittgenstein's argument about private language has never got my juices going. I sometimes have felt that there's much ado about nothing at times. It's very situated within the context of analytic philosophy in England in the early 20th century. Fair enough. But there is a kind of intimacy of being that I would defend. And if you call that privacy, that's not a very good word, actually, to do justice to something that is intimate and reserved, but in fact functions as a source of articulation. So again, when you're looking at the child, the use of the St. Augustine example about, you know, the child struggling to find words in its body, kind of flailing around and so on. You could give a much more rich reading of that than the one that Wittgenstein gives about the build a big block slab and so on. Because his own discussion is built upon certain philosophical presuppositions, and inevitably then that view of language makes it look like a tremendous set of abstractions. I'm saying go back and look at children, interact with children. Now again, most of you, I presume, haven't had children yet. Maybe I'm wrong about that, you know, kind of secretly staying up all night, disturbing your circadian rhythms for, not for the reading of Heraclitus, but for other things that I won't mention. But when you see children struggling to find words, you know that something is intimately going on there. It's secret in one sense, but it's not so secret that it doesn't find expression in a bodily struggle, in the babbling and so on. And I think that that is of huge philosophical significance. It's a kind of a threshold where we don't really know what's going on when language is seeded in us. But we do know for sure that if someone doesn't speak to the child as it's trying to babble, it never really will fully develop its own wording. You know, children who are neglected are often much less adept and versatile. It's when the other is jabbering to it. I mean, you have to jabber to the child, but jabbering is an absolute essential thing to do. You have to return yourself to become an infant almost, to help the infant to come into the space of adult articulation. So to come back to Wittgenstein, to me that's a kind of an abstract philosophical theory that needs a little bit more of watching real children.
Something interesting to support that is I'm like reading and researching things about deaf children babbling, and they babble with their hands. So it's the same kind of thing about like what you were saying, how it's not just done like making noise with their mouth, like they're copying and trying to figure out language.
I mean, we I think mostly in the West have lost the art of our body. Again, my daughter-in-law is Italian, so all these various gestures and so on they're words. Apparently that means if the pasta is nice, you do that, and it's full. It's a simple, movement of the hand on the cheek, but it communicates a world of satisfaction. So the Italians are still in touch with their bodies as linguistic words, whereas we, kind of Northern Europeans kind of, where's my iPad? Where's my GPS? Thank you, Lord, for GPSs, I can say. I'd have been lost many a time in Los Angeles recently without a GPS, so I'm not attacking modern technology, don't get me wrong. But the body, the fluency of the body is itself a wording of or sense of being in the world. This is something that we ought to pay attention to. And children, of course, if the mother is tense, or if the father is tense and so on, body language, as we call it, is taken up by the child. And sometimes to the detriment of the child, becoming anxious, shutting up. We look at a person in the face and we see a kind of a little trace of a cloud of anger, and we shut up. So communication is also a space of hospitality. It needs to be a hospitable space and not just merely a hostile space. So all the dimensions of human life begin to manifest themselves in this between of communicative interaction. Two minutes to go.
Does this have implications for how we should open ourselves to other points of view?
It does. Certainly it does, yeah. But again, as I said, the word gibberish is equivocal. So I guess there's gibberish and there's gibberish. If, for instance, I get terribly drunk which I have no experience of, in fact. But if I get terribly drunk and start gibbering, it's significantly different than when I'm on the verge of uttering a most beautiful poem. So we have to have what Pascal calls the esprit de finesse in reading the signs. So reading the signs, this is again the hermeneutical act, is very, very important. But I suppose the plea of my paper is that don't dismiss strange languages simply as gibberish. I mean, it's very relevant to the whole issue of the emigrant, for instance, with another language. If you yourself go into a foreign country and you don't have the language, one of the effects actually is you feel infantilized. You can't communicate because you don't have the words. I remember years ago going to China and the menu, all these kinds of things, I hadn't a clue what they were. So I sort of, like a child, point and they'd bring stuff out, and some of it was absolutely delicious. And I'd gobble it up. But some things were, I'd just take one bite and I would be just like a child. You know, when you try to give spinach to a child and the mouth clamps, and then you try to give a rational argument, but it's good for you, Johnny. Well, I felt like a child. I was infantilized. I am not going to eat a second bite of that. So the lack of language is an entry into the world of the other, and I think we need to have a hermeneutics of hospitality to strange languages. Because, as I said, the gibberish is gibberish and not gibberish. And we ought to be discriminating, discerning, finessing these relations. Okay.